Welcome to In Conversation with writer and editor Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life, a monthly chat with writers, publishers, and those who support the literary arts. Today, Sheila is talking with Seattle area poet Judith Skillman, who has written over a dozen volumes of poetry and the craft book, Broken Lines.
Hello, this is Sheila Bender. You're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, we're speaking with Judith Skillman, a poet from Newcastle, Washington, a suburb of Seattle. She's published 14 books of poetry, with I'm sure more coming in the future. Born in Syracuse, New York, of Canadian parents, she holds dual citizenship. She's an amateur violinist, the mother of 3 grown children, and the Grammy of twin girls. She has a master's degree in English literature from the University of Maryland and has taught at the University of Phoenix, Richard Hugo House in Seattle, City University, and Yellowwood Academy. She's been the recipient of an award from the Academy of American Poets for her book Storm, and she's been awarded a King County Arts Commission Publication Prize, Public Arts Grant, and a Washington State Arts Commission Writers Fellowship. 2 of her books were finalists for the Washington State Book Award. Red Town and Prisoner of the Swifts were the titles. Skillman's poems have appeared in Poetry, Field, the Southern Review, the Iowa Review, the Midwest Quarterly, Prairie Schooner, and the Seneca Review, among many other journals and anthologies. She's been a writer-in-residence here at the Centrum Foundation in Port Townsend, Washington, and the Hedgebrook Foundation, which is on Whidbey Island. At the Center for French Translation in Belgium, she translated the French-Belgian poet Anne-Marie Derez. She's been a Jack Straw writer in Seattle in 2008 and 2013, and Skillman's work has been nominated for Pushcart Prizes, the UK Kid Award, Best of the Web, and is included in the Best Indie Verse of New England. She maintains a website at judithskillman.com. Welcome to the program, Judith.
Thank you, Sheila. Great to be here.
I'm glad to have you with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your poetry and to talking about a book that I didn't mention in our introduction, which is what you call your one how-to book, Broken Lines, The Art and Craft of Poetry. I'm especially interested in talking about that one because as a teacher, I have used it in the classroom with upperclassmen in an undergraduate creative writing program at Seattle University, and they got quite a lot out of it and were very inspired, and you cover a lot of ground in a short book. So I'm sure it's written from your experience writing poetry for so many years and publishing so many books. Perhaps we should start there. What encouraged you to write a book called Broken Lines, The Art and Craft of Poetry?
Well, it began really with various parts of the book. I didn't know that I was writing a book. I was honored enough and privileged to teach at the Hugo House and got to put some courses together there. Ultimately, it became something of a project where I wanted to give back to this community of Northwest writers that has given me so much. Because I moved here from Maryland 31 years ago, having just gotten a master's in English Lit from the University of Maryland. They didn't offer an MFA, so my emphasis was a thesis of creative writing and a book of manuscript of poems. So once I moved here, I just felt like the world of poetry kind of opened up, and I first found out what a horrible writer I was, actually, and then tried to improve.
Well, that's a very good place to start, isn't it? And I'm sure it will give lots of listeners a lot of confidence to hear you say that 12 or more books later. So this community really nurtured your writing.
Absolutely. Both in the sense of the natural beauty here, which I already knew from a few visits to the Olympic Peninsula, which is partly the reason we moved here. My husband's parents had retired in Sequim. So my picture, of course, was a bit unrealistic. It was Sequim in August, the Great Northwest. It's very, very warm weather and beautiful skies. It was also the green, a lot of green. I feel a little inarticulate right now. It's not my circadian rhythm time of day.
And you don't have a pen in your hand? I bet. I think your articulation happens.
Well, I always hold a pen.
Okay. Like
I hold a pen.
All right. Well, that'll help. So all that green and the natural beauty and the mountains and the snow inspired your writing?
Absolutely. The flora and fauna, especially, which are very different than from the East Coast, And the lack of tropical insects was especially refreshing. And I just really felt inspired. It was kind of like being in a poem, really. Once I moved here, I just felt that inspiration in the natural objects and the landscapes and the scenery.
So, do you consider yourself a landscape poet?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think there's so many different aspects to write about in life. Obviously, the subject matter changes as you go through your life. That was definitely the starting point once I moved here, along with, of course, childhood. I never get done with writing about childhood. Mm-hmm. It's always with me, and maybe because I feel I had a, quote, bad childhood, but as I've grown and matured, I've learned that pretty much everyone does, so, or maybe some people don't, but I would say the majority of people do have some suffering in their childhood.
And for some reason, poetry does seem to be the rhetorical form that helps us cultivate our own articulation of what went wrong, so that hopefully we can heal and move past that. And I'm remembering my own teacher, the poet William Matthews, one day saying to the class, everybody's had two childhoods, the happy one and the unhappy one, and we can write from both of them. And I think one of his books is titled A Happy Childhood. That's always stayed with me. I know that I'm more likely to have written from the unhappy one than the happy one, but I try to find the happy one because another one of my teachers, and someone I'm sure that you have studied with and know well, Nelson Bentley at the University of Washington, used to say that it's very important for a poet to write one funny poem a month, because he was very well aware of the sadness that comes with so many poems. So in wanting to give back to the community that nurtured you, you wrote this book, which you said came from creating some classes for Richard Hugo House.
Yes, and many other things that I had done, because I do consultations with writers who have a manuscript that they're shaping, either chapbook or full length. So I've been lucky to have just amazing clients that have taught me so much. And in working with them, I have put together materials. So I use some of those. And then behind probably the driving inspiration, it sounds like a technical book, Broken Lines, which came from, of course, the line breaks. And I do explore that in the book. But it's the urge to write and feeling blocked to write, which I've just heard so many poets and writers talk about. And of course it's happened to me. Of course there's those feelings when you're just, or at least I feel, extremely frustrated. Like, where's news? Hello?
Right.
I'm ready to write.
Right.
But I feel something on the horizon, or even further, like past, way out at sea. That, I think that creative drive is possibly and happily incomprehensible to people who don't feel driven to write. But for people who do, it's a very unpleasant place to be. Well, what I learned from a class that I taught at the Hugo House was exploring ars poetica poems, which is basically the poet's métier, their reason for writing, their point of view, their feeling in many aspects of why they write, whether it's an obligation or it's underlying the theme of a poem that's often called their ars poetica, can motivate people who are stuck if they write their own sort of raison d'etre poem, like I write because.
Right, and remind
and
themselves.
The book is full of those.
Right. And you have the second chapter in your book is called Giving Writer's Block the Boot. So that's one of your techniques, right? One of my favorite chapters in the book had to do with, you call it the spark, collaboration and inspiration. I think that we think of poetry as a solitary occupation, writing poetry, and you have in this chapter examples of working with photographers, memoirists, musicians, textile artists. Do you want to say anything about that as how that developed as a way you might help other people write?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of my favorite parts, is stepping out from the vacuum, the isolation, and the insular world of writing on your own and finding someone to collaborate with. And in a way, it kind of fell in my lap the first couple of times, so I felt really lucky with the photographer Ron Hammond, who came to me saying, I have these photographs and I'd like to have poems for them. And it kind of just worked out. I had spent some time in the Midwest, and that's what his photographs are about, basically. I found it incredibly inspiring, whether it was to collaborate with a visual artist, a textile artist, a musician. There's so many ways, and I think that is being more developed in our community with the with the dance. I did something where in Bellingham, some dancers choreographed to a poem that I'd written. Those opportunities are out there for poets.
And that's wonderful that you're making that a more public choice for poets by including it in this book. One of the things I was struck with was the collaboration with memoir writers, because poetry is, in a way, a kind of memoir if you're writing from your personal experience. And we don't think of it that way normally. And I'm wondering if how writing the little pieces you wrote that are in prose memoir helped you with poetry.
Well, I guess it would go back to journaling, because I, like many poets and writers, started by journaling in my teens, very morose, horrible things that were on my mind. And I do think that it's just like with fiction, there's such a thin line between reality and then what we choose to make of it, that you have to give a disclaimer, any resemblance to characters living or dead is purely coincidental. And it really isn't, in my mind. It's not usually coincidental. In fact, writers have to go to great lengths to mask their characters quite often so that they won't offend anyone, and often they still do. So back to your question, I guess, I like to think of writing the boundaries of each genre spilling into the other, so that it's a continuum. It's not just like, oh, I'm a poet, or only writing poems. We need to widen that and feel that we can break out into prose, and maybe that prose will become a poem.
Mm-hmm. I know I had my students write short prose memoirs modeled after what you were doing in the book, and then from their prose write what we then called short memoir, which were more like dense prose poetry, typically, like Naomi Nihab Shai's Mint Snowball is one of her books that she calls them paragraphs because she thought that was a better name than an intimidating name like prose poems. She said everybody likes paragraphs. Everyone can read a paragraph.
That's right.
And so I like this idea of not feeling intimidated by exploring other forms, although I know that poets may feel unusual not breaking their lines in different places than the margin, or they might feel like writing in long sentences, although lots of poems have long sentences, but they might feel that that's kind of unusual. But I think stretching is really important, and understanding that the boundaries of the genres are imposed by people who need to call what they're doing something. Or by
That's an excellent point.
Creative writing programs have to say what they're teaching. So if it wasn't journalism, what was it? So it was creative nonfiction, for instance. And what's the difference ultimately between a prose poem and a lyric essay? And maybe you've explored this too, but I just think the catch-all, blurring the boundaries and extending into different genres kind of helps. And so people don't really have to know what they're writing in order to write. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, and exactly. I couldn't possibly say that any better, because I think if we know too much about what we're doing and what we're writing, that squelches the exploration of the process, and that's the most important part. And I remember one of my thesis advisors at the University of Maryland said, turn your page the long way, or write on an index card. Change because back then, obviously, I had to be kind of weaned off of paper and into the word processing world, and of course I'm part of that whole technology now, but at the time it was like, every poem was just turning out to have the same line length and the same margins, and it's just not conducive to what David Wagner calls being the madwoman or the madman and taking off your sensorial hat, which is essential to that deep exploration in associative writing that I love.
Right, and being free to write from margin to margin can help us find the material that will later be a poem that has line breaks in it.
In case you've just joined us, you're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking with Seattle area poet Judith Skillman, who has written over a dozen volumes of poetry and the craft book, Broken Lines.
I wonder if this isn't a good time for us to hear one or two of your poems.
Sure. I'll start with a poem that's not particularly new, but it kind of explores this nature, actually, of our whole state, because my husband loves the eastern part of the state, Cleellum. Thanks to him, I've been over there a few times. So it's titled The Skull. You walked up Tabletop Mountain and found a skull, a coyote, dog, or wolf. You are not sure. Perhaps a deer. You run your finger along the teeth, yellowed ivories glowing, molars, compacted surfaces. Not a single one missing. The animal died young. For the skeletal grin, you feel wistful, even as a man. Is there a secret you missed along the way? A better kind of life lived among the ruins of nature, rather than this entrapment where you fight your way through each urban day, return to the well-kept house at night? You walked up Tabletop, looked far out where the shape-shifting begins again between brother and sister mountains, twisting sharp peaks southwest, wooed by the moon, raising its single horn in the east. When you picked up the skull, it walked with you, breathed through eye sockets wide open, as with the sudden shocked surprise of you are not sure which, being dead or carried in your hand.
Thank you. Far from the green and
Yes.
the water, and very, very stirring. What was the second one you were going to read?
This one is one that was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The editor there has a column on poetry and medicine, so people should be aware of that.
Okay.
She needs a poem a week.
Oh, that's wonderful
She's
to know.
looking for poems, and she's a lovely editor. Sometimes if she likes something, but it's not quite right, she'll assist with it, quite often, in fact.
That's amazing.
So this one is titled Seasonal Affective Disorder, or I should say that is the acronym for which is SAD, which many people here suffer from due to our depressingly gray weather. Seasonal Affective Disorder. Outside, birds on oiled wings cross a sky barge-colored, stale. The old man's become different than himself. He casts his net for arguments, lies listless on a sofa covered in bright flowers she selected. Their stems prickle his side. Her voice, not again in the background, going on about this or that. Snow plies the streets of New York. The boroughs no longer navigable as his thoughts begin to vie with memory. And again, her hand gestures as if it were a signet he could follow or understand. The book, Judge and Jury, back broken, fans its pages on the coffee table. He's halfway through. A lost last territory still left to conquer, and winter just beginning its reign.
Thank you. It occurs to me to ask you a question about writing in the third and second person. This poem is in the third person, the hymn. And the other poem, I think I kept hearing you for a while in the poem. Do you want to address that? Do you write in the first person as well?
Oh, yes. I have another poem I could read.
Is
in the first person. I wasn't sure what to read for
well,
today.
if you want to read
if
you want to read in the first person, that would be wonderful, and then we could talk a little bit about why you choose a particular person to write in.
Okay, if we have enough time.
We do.
Sure, okay. Well, this is actually a prose poem. That's what I call it. According to David Wagner, who's one of my obvious heroes, there is no such thing as a prose poem, but it's got very long lines. My father returns as the jack-in-the-box in a dream. He's waited on the bed to spring up at me, always the same clay flesh. Of course, in the silence that ensues, you'll have to take my word for this. As when one tells a dream, it disappears. But no, my father, a little figure, still attached to the tiny bed from which he leaps like a rattler coiled in the heat, like a monster to scare a schoolgirl. And this would happen every time I opened the door. Dreams are not past, present, nor future. When I was 80 years old, my father was still made of dough, underbaked, yeasty, never risen quite enough to believe in. When I was 70, my father sprung from the box, and the phrase he said, well, you'll have to content yourself. I don't remember.
Chilling. So I know this might not be a fair question because I think a lot of poets don't even know the answer to how the voice comes. But can you describe anything you do know about the differences between choosing I, choosing he, choosing you?
It's something I've become more aware of, I suppose, the more that I've written. It's not something that I believe a writer should think about at first, or make a choice of. It's necessarily a conscious choice, but I think that there is the least detachment in the first person from your subject matter. I mean, so it's often my first choice, the first person, because I don't want to have a detached view of what I'm writing about, and often I just feel a lot of strong emotion, and I just want to be there with it in the first person. However, there's times when I'm really either angry, curious, or more in wonderment, and I want to talk to you. Usually use singular, but sometimes use plural. And then if in the event that there's just almost like a novella exploding outside your window, just want to write about it, it's better, I think, for the third person.
So when you say you want to speak to the you in the poem, The Skull, is a particular you?
Yeah, in that case it was my husband, Tom, and the poem is dedicated to him, but in a note, not underneath. But it was a deer skull. He actually has the skull in the garage. And we both wondered when he found it, what was it? And it was this kind of shrouded in mystery, this kind of poetic mystery that was
right. So it's kind of a continuation.
Written about.
The poem may be a continuation of a conversation you were having, but at a kind of deeper level than we might actually have. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely.
So do you ever do you ever write in the you when you're trying to get distance from your own I, that the you isn't a particular person other than you yourself, the writer?
Oh, definitely, because I feel that often anger, which I suppose everyone feels a lot of anger or some amount of anger sometimes.
I think so.
I hope so. I think so. I think it's healthy, as long as it's not acted out. I think it's very healthy to be aware of one's anger. And then as far as writing in the second person, you can be imperative. You can be the little God. You can order people around. You can get mad. You can do whatever you want. It's a very freeing voice.
Do you think that advice to write in the you might actually be part of that advice for getting over writer's block?
Oh, certainly. I hadn't thought of it that way, but Sheila, I definitely think so.
Well, it occurred to me when you're talking about the naturalness of having anger, but we usually censor it, you said, because we can't act it out. But it seems then that it might be a very convenient way to start writing again.
Definitely. I wish I could make a second edition of Broken Lines because there's so many typos I want to fix.
Well, with the internet, you can add an addendum right there on your webpage. So
true.
Yeah, so people can go right there and see more. Well, we're never done writing. And so maybe there's a second edition of Broken Lines. I don't think it would be called Mended Lines, but because I think
it could be called You.
Well, there is an anthology out of, not poetry, I don't think is in there, but it's called You, an anthology of writing in the second person. It was out, I think, a couple of years ago, maybe. It's pretty new. It's very stirring what people can say in the you. And I think it's a lovely versatility that you have in being able to write in the first person and the third person and to a particular you, as well as a more general you that's you, but not the you that you want to act out the anger as, and so you adopt you. So Before we end our conversation, you've written an extraordinary number of poetry books, I think, and it isn't easy to get poems published, let alone volumes of poems. So do you have any comment on your good luck with writing so much, so well, and so frequently published?
Well, I think a lot of it is luck. It's a very subjective business. Perseverance is the key, because obviously if you've been an editor or if you've watched editors or even if you've sent out, sometimes the poem that they choose is like the last one you think that they'd want in your personal opinion about your poetry. So I have, a sort of blind ambition or just some kind of, maybe it's a sadistic urge to submitted a lot. And I also love tinkering with manuscripts almost as much as individual poems, because like puzzles that come together differently, and so I'll keep modifying them and changing them. And then I think a mistake writers can make, or poets in particular, is to feel that their work is carved in stone, because as you said, it's never finished. Even once it's published, you're going to find things you want to change. So to keep revising individual poems and revising manuscripts.
Uh-huh.
And there is a part in Broken Lines about thematic development of your manuscript, because theme is so important in pulling a manuscript together. Finding out what the theme is.
Right. That's a big conversation, and I hope we'll get to talk again in the future just even about that. Do you think there's a sort of basic number of poems people should shoot for a manuscript?
Well, a book length traditionally used to be 48 minimum, and that would include front matter, section breaks, and back matter. So it's not that far from a chapbook to a book, really, and I always encourage my clients or my students to go for the book because it's got a spine.
Uh-huh.
That's just a selfish bias.
That's a good metaphor. Yeah. So how many poems are a chapbook then?
Well, again, that varies tremendously, because if you look at AWP, the Chronicle, or any place to submit online, they'll want anywhere from, even now, from some very slender chapbooks of 8 or 10 poems, if it's a sequence, up to 40. So
I see.
I don't think there's a set number for
right.
a chapbook.
Well, we're going to have to end soon, but I just do have a question. Do you know how many poems you've written?
Oh no, I have no idea.
Okay, well, maybe that's very refreshing, because the work goes forward, and even though you're going back and revising, it's a fabulous thing not to actually really know. I like that. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your poetry and your life in poetry and your love of the Northwest as well. So thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Sheila. It's been a pleasure.
I hope we speak again soon.
Me too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by...